Well, the Prime Minister is in the Cook Islands for the Pacific Islands Forum, during which he agreed to give $350 million to the Pacific Climate Infrastructure Financing Partnership, so to help fight climate change. It also comes as there's a particular sore spot that remains in the AUKUS deal to obtain nuclear-powered submarines. The Pacific region is strictly nuclear-free, and it wants to remain that way. But there's more and more Chinese money flowing into the region, including that security pact with the Solomon Islands. Joining me now to discuss is the former Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Peter Jennings. Peter, great to see you again. Look, I want to start with the Prime Minister's trip to China. You wrote a very strong column earlier this week, basically saying that it's fine to stabilise ties as long as Australia continues to disagree where it needs to with China. Do you think we saw Anthony Albanese raising any points of criticism or issues, whether it was cyber attack, whether it's the origin of COVID, whether it's foreign influence and interference? Do you think the Prime Minister should have been a bit stronger raising these issues with the dictator Xi Jinping?
Sharri, the whole visit seemed to be pretty light on for substance. Lots of photo opportunities, talk about pandas, talk about the handsome boy running on the Bund in Shanghai. Interestingly, the G7 foreign ministers issued a statement overnight saying that whilst dialogue with China is good, it needs to focus in on substance, including the things that you've raised, China's intense cyber spying on democratic countries, China's militarism in the South China Sea, its threats towards Taiwan. I really don't get the sense that these things were talked about in any depth. How could they be in an hour meeting with Xi Jinping, which was translated? And so while the Prime Minister said, he touched on a number of issues to do with human rights, for example, I don't believe any substantial discussion took place. And here's a problem. A lot of people have said, well, it's great that we're back talking with China. But I guess my point would be, if we can never get into a place where we can have serious exchange in detail on these big strategic issues, it's not really going to advance our interests very far. And it just makes China look as though it's, taking tribute from one of the minor powers in the region.
Look, the Pacific Islands Forum in the Cook Islands at the minute, New Zealand hasn't attended, PNG hasn't attended, many other places, leaders, PNG, I think Solomon Islands also hasn't attended. We have. You see the Prime Minister turning up in those, colourful shirts every single day. He's committed $350 million effectively for climate change in the Pacific. Do you think this is the best use of the money, and how do you think Australians will react to it, given we are in a very serious cost of living crisis and interest rates just went up for the 30th time this week?
I think there will be a lot of eye-rolling domestically about it. Sharri, I accept that Australia's got a serious job of work to do building relations with Pacific Island countries, and that takes money. I think practical cooperation is necessary. I don't know how much of that $350 million is ever going to sort of find its way to improve the lives of Pacific Islanders today, which have some of the poorest economic indicators in the world around healthcare, infrastructure, education, employment. There's so much more that we could be doing of a practical nature to help individual Pacific Islanders. And then I would like to see a larger Australian defence presence, more ships and aircraft in the region, Australian Army engineers doing good practical works to assist remote island communities. We've done all this stuff in the past, but promises of big money on climate, which may or may not have an impact decades into the future, I think is a kind of a feel-good way to spend money, but not one which is really focused on the practical needs of Pacific Islanders now. And Australians might be a bit cynical about that, given how hard the cost of living issues are for so many people in our own country.
Look, you were in a previous role, the Deputy at Australia's Defence Department. So I just want to also ask you about the war on Hamas, the Israel war on Hamas at the moment, and the government's response to it. In my personal view, I think Albanese has been quite weak on the response. When he's asked about anti-Semitism, he turns his answer into a question. He starts speaking about Islamophobia. He's called for a humanitarian pause for a couple of days in the fighting. He keeps expressing concern about the way Israel is responding, trying to destroy Hamas, when Israel couldn't be doing more to try and save innocent lives. We even saw a report out of the BBC today where, an Israeli official called someone in Gaza who was in an apartment block, stayed on the phone until he'd evacuated his entire apartment block and the two apartment blocks next to him before they were bombing it. So my question is, do you think the Albanese government understands truly the nature of war and just how much effort Israel goes into abiding by international law?
I don't think the government understands, and I don't think they want to know, Sharri. I think they're in their comfort zone calling for ceasefires and bemoaning the risk of intolerance here in Australia without ever getting to the specifics of what's going on. The Israeli Defence Force has applied ceasefires. They've applied a number of them for periods of 4 or 5 hours every day to give people the opportunity to evacuate down to the south of Gaza. Our government doesn't appear to acknowledge that that is a reality of what's going on. They don't appear ever to acknowledge that, in fact, the Israeli Defence Force is going to extreme lengths to save civilian lives and to not target civilians. And another thing our government doesn't do is that it fails to acknowledge that Hamas command and control facilities for their fighters are actually located under hospitals, under schools, under refugee camps, through these hundreds of kilometres of tunnels which have been built. So I think the government is content to sort of keep its commentary at a very feel-good level without actually engaging in some of the really challenging aspects of what's going on, and completely failing to recognise that the Israeli Defence Force is doing a huge amount of work to not target civilians in the course of fighting against Hamas terrorists.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you never hear Albanese complaining about Hamas. It's always about Israel. Peter Jennings, thank you so much for your time.
Yes, why not?
Yeah, no,
thank you, Sharri.
Finish your sentence, yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, why not call for a ceasefire from Hamas, who are relentlessly attacking not only the Israeli Defence Force, but still firing rockets into Israel. We from the minute this conflict started, after the events of the weekend, all of the criticism has been directed towards Israel. No attention has been focused on the appalling behaviour of Hamas. And for the Australian government to be doing that, I think is frankly just, shows me that they're not interested in what's really going on the ground. They're just trying to play this for what they perceive to be some sort of domestic political benefit in a number of the electorates that they hold in Western Sydney and in Melbourne.
Yeah.